Hello, everyone, and welcome to a webinar introducing the What Works Clearinghouse Procedures and Standards Handbook, version 5.0. I am Natalia Gnatko-Berry. I'm a principal researcher at the American Institutes for Research and a contributor to the What Works Clearinghouse and the WWC Handbook. My main job today is to guide us through the webinar. I would like to begin by introducing our presenters. Dr. Emily Tanner-Smith is a professor at the University of Oregon, and Dr. Jeff Valentine, professor at the University of Louisville. Doctors Tanner-Smith and Valentine are key contributors to the What Works Clearinghouse and the WWC Procedures and Standards Handbook. We have a bit of housekeeping to do before we get started. You are welcome to submit questions or ask for clarifications in the chat box at the bottom of the Zoom webinar screen. Usually at the beginning of the WWC webinars, we get a question if the slides are going to be available. The answer is yes. We will prepare an archival version of the slides and post it on the WWC website along with the Q&A document. Our goals for today are to announce that the WWC Procedures and Standards Handbook version 5.0 is available on the WWC website since early August. We'd like to describe major changes to the WWC Procedures and Standards for individual studies and synthesis products under version 5.0, and to have a space to discuss changes and raise questions about the new version of the handbook. Today's webinar is the second webinar focused on version 5.0 of the handbook. We held the first webinar in March when the handbook was posted for public comment. The WWC made several changes in response to public comment, which you can see on this slide. For example, the WWC clarified the definition of study, provided additional guidance on baseline equivalence, clarified author query process, and included several clarifications related to single case design studies. You can find the response document on the WWC website. Because this is the second 5.0 handbook webinar, some information included in today's webinar will be familiar to those of you who attended in March. We added new information and expanded some material that we presented earlier. The webinar we hosted in March is available on the WWC website. You should be seeing a link in the chat box to the recording and to the slides. Let's begin with a little bit of history. As you can see from this slide, the WWC released a new version of the handbook about every 3 years. So why is that? Well, the refinements to the handbook are based on improvements in education research methods and in the methods used to synthesize evidence. The WWC also refines its procedures and standards to more effectively meet the needs of education decision makers and the needs of WWC reviewers. Before I hand the webinar to Drs. Tanner-Smith and Valentine, I will briefly highlight a few handbook changes and preview what certification will look like for 5.0. When you browse the updated handbook, the first thing you will probably notice is the layout changes. The handbook now includes an overview chapter, Chapter 1. This chapter describes what the WWC does and provides a summary of the WWC review process. It is a non-technical summary intended for the audiences that need to have good familiarity with the WWC, but who will not be reviewing studies. The remainder of the handbook is aimed at technical audiences, WWC reviewers in particular. The organization aligns with the study review process. So what I mean by that is, for instance, a reviewer first needs to decide if a study is eligible for a WWC review, so this information is presented first. Next, a reviewer needs to decide if a study has at least one outcome that meets WWC standards, so this is presented second, and so on and so on. I imagine that most, if not all of you here today, are familiar with the WWC review protocols. Under 5.0, the WWC will use the study review protocol as an umbrella protocol to review all studies, individual and those studies that are being reviewed for a specific WWC product, for instance, a practice guide. The WWC moved in this direction under the version 4.1, so this is not entirely new, but 5.0 solidifies this approach. You may be wondering about topic area protocols like dropout prevention and adolescent literacy. So those protocols will continue to be developed and used, but their role will be more limited. And we will have more to say about this in just a little bit. Now to the question that's on many of our minds, what the training and certification will look like under 5.0. All trainings will be available online for group designs, advanced group designs, and SCDs. This will be familiar to those of you certified in recent years. You'll have access to narrated slides for different modules, and you can watch them whenever convenient and as many times as you need. To become certified under 5.0, all new and current reviewers will need to take a multiple choice certification exam. We recommend that you view the certification modules to prepare. The WWC built in a few modifications to the 5.0 exams compared to how those exams have been administered in the past. All exams will be graded by section. If someone fails a section, they will need to retake only that section. So for instance, if you fail baseline equivalence, then a retake only will include baseline equivalence. And each certification will allow 4 attempts. Certification in group designs is the one that has been around the longest, and it is one that is used the most because the majority of studies reviewed by the WWC are group design studies. So the WWC recognizes that there is a lot of expertise in group designs among WWC reviewers. So for these reasons, the certification exam for group designs will have a test out option. This option will include questions testing critical knowledge under 5.0. You can use the test out option once. If passed, no need to take the full exam for group designs. If not, a full exam must be taken and you will have up to 4 attempts. No test out option will be available for other certification. As for the timing of exams, version 5.0 trainings and certification are scheduled for release early next year. And now we will transition to Jeff, who will take us through major changes to the WWC procedures under 5.0.
Well, thank you, Natalia. Let's start this section of the webinar with something Natalia mentioned in her introduction. So if you're familiar with how the WWC conducted study reviews under previous versions of the handbook, so for example, think about version 4.0 or version 3.0, then you'll remember that topic area teams had the ability to customize some of the WWC standards. So for example, topic area protocols indicated whether cautious or optimistic assumptions should be invoked when assessing attrition in randomized experiments. As Natalia mentioned, the WWC has been moving away from this, and in the 5.0 handbook, all decision points that were previously delegated to topic area teams are now either written into the handbook itself or have been delegated to the individual teams conducting WWC reviews. For the few decision points that have been delegated to the individual teams conducting WWC reviews, the handbook provides strong guidance regarding the relevant elements of studies that ought to be considered when making these decisions. We'll give some examples of this guidance later on in the webinar. Two primary considerations led to this change. Studies were sometimes reviewed using multiple topic area protocols. So, for example, a study might have been reviewed for two different intervention reports in different topic areas. I'm sure you can see that this is inefficient, and the WWC was trying to address this problem. In addition, sometimes different study ratings could emerge from reviews using different topic area protocols. You can imagine that this is a confusing situation for the WWC's consumers, and the WWC made the switch in part to keep that from happening. Next, I want to highlight some things about the WWC's ratings. The overarching message is that the WWC's ratings have been streamlined. For example, there used to be multiple pathways to obtaining the old positive effects rating, but now there is only one path to the analogous rating. And the WWC aligned its effectiveness ratings with the Department of Education's evidence tiers. So in this regard, whereas the WWC used to have separate criteria related to the extent of evidence, like the multiple settings and the minimum sample size criteria, these considerations have been consolidated into a single effectiveness rating that is aligned with the department's evidence tiers. So here's an example. Under 4.1, there were multiple ways that a study with more than one main finding in an outcome domain could have received the old positive effects rating. One path involved whether there were any statistically significant findings that survived a multiple comparison correction process. And another path involved assessing the statistical significance of a composite finding for all the main findings in the domain. So there were multiple paths that could be invoked when generating a rating. Under version 5.0 of the handbook, there is only one path for the effectiveness rating for a study with more than one main finding in an outcome domain, and this involves the composite finding. We'll show you a picture of this in a moment. Before doing that, I want to focus on one nuance that will end up being important for the ratings in WWC intervention reports and practice guides. Specifically, the WWC has developed an approach to meta-analysis to ensure that, when possible, most of the meta-analytic weight will be attributed to findings that meet standards without reservations. The WWC will only implement this procedure when the amount of information in the studies that meet standards without reservations is responsibly large. This is what I meant when I said that the WWC would implement this procedure when possible. But when the WWC can implement this procedure, it's a good way of allowing the more trustworthy information to be the primary driver of WWC ratings. The last slide in this section of our webinar summarizes the things that the WWC attaches ratings to and the considerations on which those ratings are based. So you can see that the WWC assigns a research rating to individual findings within studies. And then everything else builds on this finding level research rating. For outcome domains within studies, the WWC assigns both a research rating and an effectiveness rating, and you can see how these are related to the finding level research ratings. Studies also receive a research rating and an effectiveness rating. Interventions described in intervention reports will receive effectiveness ratings too. The take-home message is that the WWC aligned its effectiveness ratings with the Department of Education's evidence tiers and also streamlined the process used to generate those ratings. If you're interested in the details regarding the components of the ratings, you can see them summarized here, and of course, they're fully described in the handbook. Okay, so next, Dr. Tanner Smith will take us through some of the highlights of the changes to the WWC standards. Emily?
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Jeff. So in this next section, I'm going to walk us through some of the major changes to the WWC standards under version 5.0 of the handbook. So one of the bigger changes to the WWC standards in the new handbook is when a demonstration of baseline equivalence is required in order for a study finding to meet standards with reservations. So in earlier versions of the standards, randomized controlled trials and regression discontinuity designs were required to demonstrate baseline equivalence if those designs were determined to have a risk of bias due to compositional change, such as from attrition or joiners. So in other words, those designs were required to demonstrate the baseline group differences on protocol-specified covariates were no greater than 0.25 standard deviations, and also that those designs were required to statistically adjust for any differences larger than 0.05 standard deviations. But now, under version 5.0 of the standards, randomized controlled trials and regression discontinuity designs that have a risk of bias due to compositional change do not need to demonstrate baseline equivalence when risk of bias due to compositional change is assessed using the optimistic attrition boundary. However, these designs must still adjust for baseline group differences on required covariates as specified in the handbook. Now, the logic behind this change to the standards is that when review teams select the optimistic attrition boundary, this implies that compositional change is not expected to be strongly related to intervention status. And because both of these types of designs assign units to conditions in a controlled fashion, covariate adjustment is often sufficient for addressing much of the potential bias. So another major change to the standards in version 5.0 relates to applying the WWC attrition boundaries. So prior to the version 4.1 standards, the WWC relied on topic area review protocols to determine which attrition boundary was most suitable for a given intervention. The study review protocol that was developed as a companion to the version 4.1 standards formally designated the optimistic attrition boundary as the default boundary for reviews conducted as part of grant competitions or conducted as part of WWC systematic reviews, such as intervention reports. Now, in contrast, the version 5.0 standards now clarify that teams conducting systematic reviews of interventions must select the attrition boundary that's appropriate for that particular intervention. So in cases where review teams cannot clearly identify an appropriate attrition boundary, the cautious attrition boundary will be used as a default as a conservative approach. And so the goal of this shift is to make sure that review teams are thinking critically about the intervention and its context during the review process. And so generally, if review teams choose the optimistic boundary, it indicates that the intervention is unlikely to affect sample composition, such as through staying or leaving. So for instance, curriculum or professional development programs might be examples of the kinds of interventions where the optimistic attrition boundary may be most appropriately. Conversely, the cautious attrition boundary is appropriate for interventions that may plausibly affect sample composition. So for example, dropout prevention or school choice programs might be assumed to potentially affect sample composition. So the compositional change section of the version 5.0 handbook now provides additional examples and guidance to review teams for navigating this choice of selecting the most appropriate attrition boundary for a particular intervention. Another change that was made in the version 5.0 handbook was adding flexibility to the attrition boundaries used to assess the risk of bias due to compositional change in cluster level assignment designs. So in previous versions of the handbooks, reviewers would identify a single attrition boundary that was then used to assess not only cluster level attrition, but that same attrition boundary was also used to assess individual level attrition as well as cluster representativeness. Now, in version 5.0, review teams may select different attrition boundaries for any of these three assessments. So for instance, a review team could decide that the optimistic attrition boundary is the most appropriate for assessing cluster level attrition, whereas perhaps the cautious boundary might be appropriate for assessing individual level attrition and cluster representativeness. So this change to the standards under the 5.0 handbook is intended to more closely align with the reality of compositional change threats that operate differentially across the different levels of units in these cluster level assignment designs. Another significant change made in version 5.0 of the handbook was in clarifying the risk of bias assessment due to joiners in cluster level assignment studies. So the WWC defines joiners as individuals who enter clusters after the results of random assignment are known to anyone who could plausibly influence individuals' placement into clusters. So that might include family members, students, teachers, principals, or other school staff. Now, under previous versions of the WWC standards, reviewers needed to determine one of three types of risk of bias from joiners in cluster level assignment designs. This could be that no joiners posed a risk of bias, that only late joiners posed a risk of bias, or perhaps that all joiners posed a risk of bias. But now, under version 5.0 of the standards, this assessment has been simplified so that reviewers simply need to determine whether there is a low or high risk of bias due to joiners. So the handbook now provides clearer guidance for how reviewers should conceptualize risk of bias from joiners. And 3 decision points are used to guide reviewers in this assessment. And as shown on the screen, these decision points include the unit of assignment, the unit of measurement, and the potential of the intervention to affect joining. And as shown here on this slide, the handbook now provides general guidance for reviewers for assessing each of these decision points. So for example, if the unit of assignment in a cluster level assignment design is at the school level, and the unit of measurement is at the student level, and the potential of the intervention to affect school placements is low, then the risk of bias due to joiners is likely low. However, if the unit of assignment is at the school level, but the unit of measurement is at the teacher level, the risk of bias due to joiners is likely high due to the non-random placement of students within teachers' classrooms. So when reviewers are determining the potential of an intervention to affect joining as part of this assessment, reviewers will consider 2 questions. So first, are those with the ability to manipulate enrollment aware of the intervention, and could that knowledge plausibly influence placement decisions? And then second, is it relatively easy to join a study cluster after random assignment? So the version 5.0 handbook now provides guidance for navigating each of these decision points when assessing the risk of bias due to joiners. And the handbook also provides similar guidance on evaluating the risk of bias due to individual level attrition in cluster level assignment designs. And all of this guidance is located in version 5.0 of the handbook under the compositional change section. So under version 4.1 of the standards, bundled interventions, or what you might consider packages of interventions, were considered confounding factors because any inferences about a single intervention could not be separated from the other interventions in that bundle or package. So now, under version 5.0 of the standards, bundled interventions are no longer considered confounding factors. And that's because we acknowledge that developers and study authors may have good reasons for combining different programs in this bundled manner in order to optimize outcomes. Now, it's important to note that for regression discontinuity designs, review teams will still need to assess whether the study uses a forcing variable cutoff for intervention assignment that's also used to determine delivery of other popular services and interventions. And in those cases, the WWC would still consider those popular forcing variable cutoffs as confounding factors, which would then result in study findings receiving the rating of does not meet standards. Now, a new measurement concept that's introduced in the version 5.0 standards is the concept of measure independence. So measure independence reflects the degree of overlap between the team who's evaluating or developing an intervention and then the team that created a study's outcome measure. And so the WWC defines a non-independent outcome measure as one that was created by the study team or the intervention's developers. Now, the WWC, however, will consider a measure to be independent, even if it was created by the study team or the intervention developers, if the study provides evidence that that measure is in broader use beyond just the study that's under review. And so, for instance, this might be obvious when conducting a study review if the study includes citations to other study teams or other researchers who might also be using that measure. Now, importantly, administrative records, such as those from district or state agencies, are automatically considered independent measures. So under the 5.0 standards, the study review protocol will define the outcome domains where measure independence is a key review consideration. And that study review protocol will provide reviewers with a list of known independent measures in those outcome domains. Now, although measure independence is not a strict WWC outcome requirement, like the reliability standard, for instance, measure independence is considered in the determination of main versus supplemental finding status, which has implications then for effectiveness ratings, which Jeff described earlier in the webinar. Now, several additional important changes were also made to the WWC standards for reviewing evidence from single case designs. Now, the first major change involves the outcome reliability requirements for single case designs. So in many single case design studies, the outcomes of interest may reflect direct observation of behaviors. So outcome measure reliability is often assessed using some form of inter-observer agreement or inter-assessor agreement. Now, under version 4.1 of the standards, the inter-assessor agreement requirements were applied separately to each condition within the single case design. However, since then, many high-quality single case design studies have been found to frequently report inter-assessor agreement data across conditions, and rarely do they actually report this information separately by condition. So for this reason, the WWC has relaxed these requirements under the new standards to better align with standard reporting practices observed in many high-quality studies. And so the new standards now only require that authors report inter-assessor agreement data for the whole design, rather than requiring them to report that information separately by each condition. And finally, the 5.0 handbook now also includes changes related to the design assessment step in single case design study reviews. So for multiple baseline, multiple probe, treatment reversal withdrawal, and changing criterion designs, the number of required data points within a phase for a study to be able to achieve that highest possible research rating has now changed. So first, to receive that highest possible research rating of meets WWC standards without reservations, under the new standards, these designs are now required to have 6 or more data points in their initial baseline phase and 5 or more data points in every subsequent phase. So under previous versions of the standards, these types of single case designs were only required to have 5 data points in each phase in order to be able to receive that highest possible research rating. Now, it is important to note that under the new standards, the WWC has also added an exception that allows single case designs with shorter phases to still achieve that highest possible rating. So any phases with 3 or more data points and 0 within phase variance, including the initial baseline phase, are considered to have sufficient data points to be eligible to receive that highest research rating. And the logic behind this exception is that if a phase has 3 data points, which all have the exact same value or don't have any within phase variance, then gathering more data is unlikely to be informative. Now, finally, the WWC has also added a new step called limited risk of bias to the review process for these same 4 types of single case designs. And this process now will use the non-overlap of all pairs method to guide decisions about minimal therapeutic baseline trend and evidence of reversibility. So this method's intended to be analogous to some of the visual analytic judgments that are used to assess the internal validity of single case designs in practice. So this now concludes our summary of the major changes to the version 5.0 standards. And so I'm happy to hand it over back to my colleague Natalia for the final section of the webinar.
Well, thank you, Emily, and thank you, Jeff, for walking us through changes to the WWC procedures and standards. I want to mention that the document that summarizes all major changes in 5.0 is available on the WWC website. And so next, I would like to take a quick walk through the timeline. So here we are. So the handbook was released in early August. Updates to the study review protocol are scheduled for this fall, so still in 2022. Training and certification guidelines and materials are scheduled for early 2023, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, and study review guides will be released in spring of next year. And this is it for us today. Thank you all for joining us. We hope that you found that today's webinar helpful. As always, please feel free to send additional questions or thoughts to us through the WWC Help Desk. Have a good rest of the day.